Good evening and welcome. My name is Lynn Cook. I'm the curator here and organizer of this program. And I'd like to begin, as usual, by thanking our patrons. We can't thank them enough. This program depends very, very much on the goodwill and generosity of Art for Art's sake. And seeing a big audience like this tonight confirms how much appreciated this series of talks is. I'd also like to thank Kristen Poor and Patrick Heilman for their ongoing and sterling efforts to make the program run so smoothly. And above all, to welcome Anne-Mi Lee, who's going to talk tonight on Michael Heizer. Anne-Mi studied at Stanford, graduating in 1981 in biology, and then turned to photography, studying at Yale later, where she got her MFA. Her work has been widely seen internationally. She was included in 1997 in one of the new photography shows at the Museum of Modern Art. It's a show that the department does periodically when it identifies new or emerging photographers. And I remember that very vividly. There were photographs of Vietnam, black and white photographs, which made a very strong impression, I think, on many people. As I said, she's shown widely. 3 years ago, she was commissioned by DEA in Beacon to respond to the collection or the location or the fabric of the museum in some form. And she made a project which centered around the quarry in Clinton, which is just outside Poughkeepsie, where a lot of the trap rock that is found in buildings here in the city, probably in the base of the Statue of Liberty, probably in the car park at Beacon and elsewhere was mined. And this enormous open-cut mine formed the base for a suite of photographs that were taken at different times of the year, which made a remarkable study that reflected not only on the history of the region, but on responses to photography and to the painting of the history of the Hudson Valley Landscape School. So it dialogued with works by Smithson as well as with the heritage of Church and Cole and others. So it's particularly nice that she has chosen to speak on Michael Heizer's work. Heizer is an artist who DEA has had a long connection with, and whose work also engages with landscape in very particular ways that may speak to issues that you see in Anne-Mi's photographs and may come out through the course of this talk. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you for coming tonight, and Lynn, thank you for inviting me. I chose to speak about Michael Heizer because his work and indirectly the work of other land artists have challenged me to think about the medium that I work in, which is photography, and it has challenged me to think beyond my subject matter. What's going on here? It has challenged me to reconsider my work and to reconsider my subject matter, which is the landscape. Of course, I'm approaching Michael Heizer's work as a visual artist and not as a scholar or an art historian. So I'm sort of free associating all these ideas and the things that intuitively attract me to his work. And while I was doing my research, I realized how how much time I could be spending, checking the facts and reading more things. And so I hope you'll forgive me if there's anything I say that may not be right. And actually, I hope that this is a dialogue and that if you had something to contribute, I would love it if you would interrupt me and add or change anything. This is Michael Heizer's double negative and his first most prominent earthwork. And there are two trenches that are cut in the edge of the Mormon Mesa in Nevada. And it was revolutionary, one of the first earthworks created as part of the land art movement. And it grew out of an age of experimentation and an age of rebellion that ushered in, I believe, a renewed interest in the Western and the American landscape. This is a movement that was quickly taken up by a generation of photographers. They were gathered in an exhibition called the New Topographics, and their work have gone on to influence a number of contemporary photographers, and myself included. And so I wanted to talk a bit about what the new topographic photographers are interested in and some of the ideas that are echoed in Heizer's work and other land artists' work. This is more details of the double negative. This is an aerial view. And this is a satellite view, which is something that is very interesting that I wanted to talk about much more later. So the work that came out of the land art movement was happening in light of a very particular moment in the history of the United States in the 60s, and it was a time of social and political upheavals. And all of those things, of course, affect the national character of the country and affects the way artists think and the way artists work. So you have war in Vietnam, you have protest at home, you have unchecked capitalism, and I think it created this atmosphere from which earthworks came out of, and subsequently the new topographics. So it is about, in some ways, speaking out. And it was revolutionary because it was about them trying to make, well, also, I wanted to point out that the Vietnam War was very unusual in that even though wars are always about the terrain and landscape, the terrain in Vietnam, the landscape in Vietnam got so massively altered by bombing, by napalm, by Agent Orange, that I think there's, you can't ignore what was going on there in terms of the change of landscapes, and then this movement that wanted to alter landscapes as well. So the land art movement came out of that era, and the new topographic. So in terms of the photographers that were shown in this exhibition that was also revolutionary in 1975, the photographers included Robert Adams. This is one of his photographs. Bernard Hilla Becher, Frank Goki, Stephen Shore, Louis Baltz, Henry Wessel, Nick Nixon, and Joe Deal. And the two photographers that I'm going to concentrate on are Robert Adams and Louis Baltz. This is a photograph by Adams, and these are photographs by Louis Baltz. The curator who put that show together sort of gathered all these photographers because he saw this thread that was tying them together, and this is how he explained it. He said that their pictures were stripped of any artistic frills, and they were reduced to an essentially topographic state, conveying substantial amounts of visual information, but eschewing entirely the aspects of beauty, emotion, and opinion. I mean, I sort of disagree with what he said in the end, because I think that work is political. But it's very interesting how that came about. And so we need to look at what was going on in photography at the time, who was established before that important show, 1975. So you have Diane Arbus with her portraits. Here's another one. You have Robert Frank. And I think what really distinguished all of these photographers and what brings them together is the idea of intimacy. The work is political, it's critical, but it's really about this intimate relationship, whether it's fictional or not, that they bring the viewer into. That was Gary Winogrand. This is another Gary Winogrand. Interestingly enough, in war photography as well, this idea of the narrative and the personal human history and the human story. This is Larry Burroughs and Larry Burroughs. In terms of landscape photography at the time, we have the tradition of Ansel Adams. And he dates back to Stiglitz. And it's about the beauty of nature, and it's about the equanimity of the human spirit as it is found in nature. And, Ansel Adams was enthralled by the idea of finding equivalents for the beauty of nature in music, poetry, and humanity. And he sort of used photography as a complicit character in trying to serve up these ideas about natural beauty. He was a classical artist. And so these new topographic photographers sort of rebelled against that tradition, and then they also wanted to move away from that intimacy. And so where do they look? And they look at, this is another Ansel Adams, and this is Stiglitz. And so they look at 19th century photographers who I feel very close to, and that's why I bring them up as well. This is Roger Fenton. They are the first pictures, the pictures of the Crimean War, and it was the first war that was extensively recorded by camera, and this is in the early 1850s. And what is it about the 19th century photographers that their practice or their style that attracted these new topographics photographers? It's about a different approach to scale, a different approach to landscape. It's about surveying. It's about human activity in relationship to landscape. And it plays with the idea of a document in a very broad way. And this is still Roger Fenton, the Shadow of the Valley of Death. And this is Gustave Le Gray photographing the maneuvers of the French army under Napoleon III in Chalon. And it's very choreographed, and it's about activities played onto the landscape. And this is still Le Gray. And I think one of the most important photographers for the new topographic artist is Timothy O'Sullivan. And these pictures were made from 1867 to 69, when he was the official photographer of the US geological exploration of the 40th parallel under Clarence King. These landscapes had never been painted before, which is very important. So he sort of approached them without any preconceived notions. And I think for him it was, that same idea of surveying and exploring and taking pictures of nature as untamed and as industrialized, without any sort of reference to the painterly conventions. I think one can't help feel the monumentality of the landscape. The scale is just so vast that one can't help but feel, insignificant at times. So it's that power of nature that he managed to capture so well. And I think all of those ideas are echoed in one way or another in the land art artist, such as Michael Heizer. So now, after we've gone through this bit of history of photography, I'll just go back and look at Robert Adams' work and Lois Baltz. This is from Adams' series called The New West, and it was made towards the end of, before the end of the Vietnam War, actually. It was started during the Vietnam War, and it was published in 1974. And he went west in the same way that Michael Heizer committed himself to the Western landscape and explored housing tracts that were built along the Colorado Front Range. And these developments are filled with people, let me show you some more pictures, who had migrated west in search of a new Eden, and only to discover themselves isolated in a very artificial landscape. So the recurring themes for him are loneliness, isolation, that often result from a rapid growth. I think one of the things that he embraced from O'Sullivan was this idea of stepping back and sort of surveying the landscape from a particular distance that sort of created this sensation of what we call cool objectivity, even though I think the work's political. But it gave us a sense of being able to see things from further back. This is still Robert Adams. And some of these photographers from New Topographics also adopted the 19th century camera, the large format camera, which is very cumbersome. So they didn't just adopt the practice, but also the camera many times. This is Lois Baltz. This is from a series called Park City. This was published much later, I think in the late 70s. And these photographs show the rapidly growing developments in the ski resort near Salt Lake City in Utah. And he first shows the landscape before the constructions, and you see how it is a wasteland, and it's littered with bits of wood and wire and copper and iron, and these are residues from the mining waste on the land that happened before that. And then he shows the changes. And I think ironically, once the houses are finished, there's an incredible sense of starkness and desolation that emanates from these pictures. Other photographers who have been influenced by the 19th century tradition, Stephen Shore, who was part of the topographics. This is another Stephen Shore. So this idea of the blazing trail and the pioneering spirit that was dying, and I think in some of these pictures, he tried to capture that. Joel Sternfeld, who was not in that exhibition. And both these photographers used the 8x10 view camera. This is still Joel Sternfeld. And this is an early Gursky. So, so then I think you can see how some of those ideas that these photographers were interested in, whether it's 19th century or the new topographic photographers, are sort of echoed in Heizer's work. The fact that they sort of rejected Ansel Adams' practice is also parallel to the way some of the earthwork artists and other artists of that generation questioned the traditional methods of art practice. Judd, Naumann, taking sculptures off the pedestal and finding other ways of layering paint, besides just on the surface, taking work out of the museum and making a statement about ownership and being anti-institution. I think in particular for Heizer, something that really drew me to his work was also the ways of working that he's involved in that talks about place, materiality, activities such as a group effort, and the idea of blazing the trail. So, I mean, in the end, I think when you look at his work and this whole idea of land being a greater force to reckon with, and ultimately nature is alienating and I think is something that's a recurring theme in the way the West was explored in photography. Other aspects of Heizer's work that interested me, people talk often about the military metaphors in the structures that he uses, and just not in the structures. I think the site that he chose is interesting. It's sort of secondary, but the fact that Nellis Air Force Base is only 30 miles away from city. The government Area 51 is not that far either, and I think a few hours away is the future site for this national nuclear waste that's going to be installed and that he's trying to stop from happening. And then, of course, the Nevada being the site of a lot of nuclear testings in the 50s. But so, the idea of the bunker in terms of metaphors for the military in terms of the shape. I think people talk about blast sites, and then, of course, the trenches, you can't really ignore them. This is a view of the complex one in city, and this is an aerial view of Phan, which is one of the airfield that was constructed and expanded during the Vietnam War. There were very few airports in Vietnam at the time. I think there were just 3. And the landscape was altered very quickly, and this was installed for utilitarian reason. So again, to go back to the idea of landscape and war, the terrain is something that is always being taken in consideration in war, but I think in Vietnam it was very special. The enemy was the landscape, in addition to the Viet Cong. And so you have, this incredible altering of the landscape that happened with napalm, Agent Orange. This is a map, and the darker parts are the parts that were actually sprayed with Agent Orange. Heizer is fascinated by engineering, moving things, and I think I have a picture of him at work. And again, this is free associating the Navy Seabees in Vietnam. I mean, it was just extraordinary and at the same time ghastly what they could do, bringing bulldozers by plane, exporting and importing everything into Vietnam, and completely altering the landscape and trying to make it as friendly for their purpose as possible. And this is roads that were opening, airstrips that were installed, and the shapes and the form are very reminiscent of what's being used in land art. And so the idea of the group effort, of the group labor is in some place that's desolate and that's far-flung is I think, something that was interesting. And this is a picture of a double negative being constructed. And so the idea of the trench. This is a compression line from 1968. Where was it installed?
Where is that?
I'm sorry?
Where is that, please?
Yes, I'm trying to ask Lynn. Oh, it was in the Mojave Desert. No? Yes? Okay. So there are a number of tunnels of wood that are made underneath the ground. But I think what was most fascinating to me when I saw this, and this is from inside, is I don't know if you guys know about these Kuchi Tunnels that were built in Vietnam that were just extraordinary. This is the entrance to one of them. The most famous is the Kuchi Tunnel. I'm sure that there are some in the north as well. And they were installed in the southern part of Vietnam, not far from Saigon. And the orange part are the entire trace of the tunnels and how extensive they were. You can see the highway along the way. And basically, the tunnels can start in the forest and end up with an exit inside an American fire base. They didn't use bulldozers. It's probably using very simple tools because of the noise. And they probably worked at night and created this incredible network of tunnels. This is a cross-section of it. And there's actually a museum now that is highly frequented by American tourists. And there are these chambers that are connecting the tunnels. You can have a dining room, you can have a conference room, a war room, hospitals, dormitories. And it just really shows how ingenious and how committed the North Vietnamese were. And I think it's also about this idea of the enemy and the landscape becoming one. I've been there, and it's really extraordinary because they're so small. Asian people are a lot slender, and so it's just made for a slender person to fit through. And whenever a GI discovered them, it was almost impossible for them to even get through because they were just, much larger. And this is one of the posters that was in the museum, and it talks so much about that idea, how in the face of U.S. military might, the Vietnamese came up with something that was so ingenious and so smart. So from looking at those Kuchi tunnels and thinking about Heizer's interest in military metaphors, I started thinking about the idea of power in his work. And I think that, his work is about acts of defiance. It's a reaction against government control. I mean, there's many things that he's concerned about, but I think the idea, the fascistic overtone of a government and of a structure is something that he reacts against. But then I also wonder, how much, whether there's any kind of identification with the oppressor. Because when you look at all of his work, in the end, I think you are made to be felt extremely insignificant and alienated. And I don't know what the answer is. And I bring this up because I think that it's something that people talk about in my work, too. I've spent a lot of time working with the military, and people also question, that fascination that I have. And I don't know why this did this. So how can I go back to my slideshow?
Oh, you press still in the lower left, there's the icons, and on the right side, it looks like a little martini glass.
That looks like a...
It's on your right side, actually.
It's on my right side?
That icon.
Oh, that one. I'm not sure what I hit that made that. Okay, great. Thank you. It also made me think, are there any women land artists, Lynn?
Nancy Holt.
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. but it made me think of whether, these acts of rebellions, but that also are part of a fascination with power and political might is something that is particular to a more masculine approach to art. Something else that I thought about was the relationship of photography and how it's used in land art. And Heizer talks about how it's essential for him that you be there and experience the site. There's no substitute. He wants you to experience the different lights, the different point of views for each site. Of course, these are not, you cannot visit these. They're not finished. This is city. It's of course, the language of, that's his palette. It's scale, it's the land, the earth, the weather, the light. But most often we experience it through a photograph. So I think photographs are so reductive and they'll never stand in for the real thing. And so what does that say about the medium? And it's very interesting to me in terms of what it means in terms of my relationship to photography and landscape. I think that when I stand somewhere and photograph something, it's a given that I have to separate, the end result from the actual experience. And I always tell my students, I teach photography, that don't be swayed by what happened there when you choose a photograph. They're two separate things. So I think that's one of the main difference between the photography as it is used in land art versus, which is a document, versus a photograph, the way us photographers would like to use it, and what we'd like it to stand for.
What's the scale of that?
It's monumental. I've never been to any of these places, but I mean, I think it's, there was a picture, there was a man, I think I had the scale. Let me go back.
If you go back 3, there's a figure in the chart.
I mean, I think he was inspired by pyramids and
2 more. Next time.
right there. And that's just, a small section, a detail of complex 1. I think he's a pretty tall man. My presentation is going a little out of whack. I think it's the same thing as walking into a cathedral in Europe. It's about making you feel insignificant, and it's about showing power, and it's about, so it has to be incredibly huge. Something else that really stands out for me that he talks about, or that is part of the experience of seeing his work, is the actual process of getting to the place. For double negative, there are very precise instructions. You look at the map, and it's recommended that you have a 4-wheel drive with high clearance, that you bring extra water, that you have good walking shoes. So it seems to me that that's something that's also part of the experience of the artwork. And in opposition to photography. I don't know why these slides take so long. So I brought some of my photographs from this project I did in 29 Palms, And I made this picture after having spent 3 hours in a Humvee wearing a flak jacket and a helmet, and it's 110 degrees, and it's something that will not be included in the photograph. So, that there are, a lot of issues with photography in terms of what it translates and how reductive it is. So that part is not, it will not be included in the final result. The smell, this was a convoy that was attacked by a rocket-propelled grenade, and there was a distinctive smell, and that's something that will not be captured in the photograph. Sound, I think all of those things are important to Heizer in the experience of his work. Sound is something that will not be captured in the photograph as well. This is a photograph of a night battle which used all sorts of explosives, from jets dropping bombs, and it's all live fire, howitzers sending in ordnance, mortars, and then the grunts in the foxholes are shooting. And it's something that will not be reproduced. So photography, the kind of photography that I try to do is about something else, and maybe it's another lecture. I think that even though the role of photography as a document in land art is so reductive, and in a way it fails, it's also interesting in that it can serve the land artist so well, because I think it educates, and I think that there's also the idea of the secret, that the speculation, because you can't go there, you can't see it, so it sort of builds it up, and I think it creates this need of people wanting to go, and I think the photographs of earthworks do that. And I think as an extension of the use of photography, I wanted to talk about satellite imagery, and how that, I think is beginning to change how one learns about these artworks and how we see them progress. This is a picture of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This is aerial photographs, so it's like high altitude surveillance. And these pictures were declassified and are accessible on the internet. And this is something that happened in the last 10, 15 years. And it's just incredible that a language that was private, that of the domain of politics and the military, is suddenly now becoming public domain. And so things are declassified, things are commercialized. This is from Operation Linebacker, the bombing of Vietnam, the planning of it. So now you can go and find pictures of Spalletti on virtual globetrotting. And there are a lot of fan sites for Heizer, and they sort of keep track of the progress of his work through satellite imagery. This is City, a scene from satellite. And this is another view. I think Heizer looks down on the idea of tourism in his work, even though, you have to be there to experience it. So, so I don't know what he thinks of this, because it's some kind of spying, it's some kind of, and this is the most recent picture that also, that I downloaded, and you can actually see where he lives, the part that has more trees and is more green. And this is from Google Map. So this idea of the blending of tourism and intelligence gathering is something that's fascinating to me. I think I'm going to end here and say that the idea of landscape is, I think, an incredibly powerful and enduring subject that artists have constantly re-explored and reinvented, because the land is a site for dialogue between the individual, the power structure, and I think about something that's much greater than us, something perhaps spiritual. That's that. Thank you. Yes, absolutely.
Anyone has a question?
Yes, sir.
You talked about the political implications of his work, which to me is I agree, it's a given, and it's anything like that is anything that's going out in a space like that. But what I'm interested in is what you have to say about the forms themselves. You haven't said anything about the forms themselves and the specific forms in relationship to the site.
Well, I mean, you can see from the forms that I mean, I'm not an expert on his work, and I've never been to the sites like most people. I think the forms up, you know, I'm sure Lynn can help me on this, but the forms are, I think I don't know how he came, but you know, I mean, they are distilled forms that have been used in the past to suggest power.
Do you think that that's the major issue that he's addressing, as opposed to the formal issue of one shape versus another, formal issue of specific geometric configurations?
That I cannot answer.
Do you think that?
No, I think his issues are more formal. I think it's inherently political. Anything like this is inherently very political. But I think that you know, a major reason why he went out there and did something on that scale is because one needs that amount of space to do a particular configuration and get the effect that one wants in that scale.
But I think you can start with forms and still inject meaning and inject.
The artist has to give it. Of course, the artist gives it meaning. That's the whole purpose. I'm just saying that my take on Heizer has always been that the primary reason for going out there is access to space. I mean, in fact, that's what he has said over and over for decades.
Well, I think it's also a place where he comes from. And he's from there, and I think Nevada is particularly significant also.
I'm not denying political implications. I agree with you completely. I'm just saying that certain geometric configurations, I mean, you know...
I mean, the idea of the bunker, I mean, you could say the work is fascistic if you take it to the extreme, you know? There's just something so awesome and about the work. And
that the specific geometric forms are made on that scale in that space just so they can be that. So there's something formal about deciding. It's a formal decision to decide to make a particular geometric configuration on an X scale as opposed to an Y scale.
So what is it going to be done?
What are you guys even doing?
It's some years away.
but you know, I think one day you know someone could walk through and snap pictures with their iPhone and send them back home.
I think over the story work, they actually shot people that tried to come.
No, this is
That's true.
But because it's private property, so if you're walking...
So he's not going to shoot if we... He has guns. Yeah?
He has guns,
But
yeah.
they're not it's like if you get attacked by roving band marauders, he has to do this.
Is funding continuing, and also has he successfully, what's happened about the train route to the Yoga flats?
The train route is really in dispute at the moment, as I understand. The whole thing's ground to a halt because there's so much opposition to it from the state. for Heizer?
Yes.
He's continued to work, there is funding. And may
Yeah.
I want to ask you, sorry.
I was wondering, this is another good question, whether there was a lot of emphasis in your talk on photography, and I was wondering if he had addressed that issue himself. In other words, picking up what you were saying about some of the formal aspects of the work, it seems that there is some attention being paid to what looks like from an aerial view. However, I did do a little research before coming today, and he absolutely is saying you must see this in person. I was just curious if he had addressed this. And, you know, that was one thing. And then secondly, I wondered whether you could address or would want to think about whether or not part of the power of the work, you just spoke about power, and it seems really obvious that this is a very potent kind of work in media. What are the powers that escapes representation, two-dimensional representation in the case?
Oh yes, because I think what he's interested in is landscape, not as planar representation, but he's interested in landscape as a whole. He's interested in the environment. He's interested in the ecosystem. So, you know, there's just no way a photograph would do anything, you know, if you take it that way. You know, for him, it's about the complete experience and landscape as much as you can, you know, take it. So it's definitely not, you know, about planar representation.
Has he spoken, for instance, about his satisfaction or dissatisfaction with, for instance, the photographic representation of his work from, say, a great view? It's hard for me to know because it looks like one thing is.
Yeah, what do you think, Lynn? I mean, he let the New York Times photograph his work, and I think.
That was a singular instance.
Yes.
On the whole, he has not wanted photography. But I think you made an interesting point where you, both in relation to photography that came out during the Vietnam War, but maybe also photography that came through the moonwalk and explorations of that kind. There was a moment at which aerial viewpoints in particular became very much part of the everyday language. And there is a number of photographs of, and you've shown them, particularly the early ones of double negative and the 9 pieces in the Mojave and others. They're amongst the first works of art, I think, that art photographed
aerially.
And you could see that in the case of Smithson, who hired a helicopter and photographer to take professional shots for him, videographers and so on. So this is these kinds of representations, for all that they're reductive, as you say, there's a kind of reverse fascination with a style or an ability to photograph that's quite different from other kinds of photography that had been prevalent at that moment. And I think your talk brings it out very well.
Yeah. But there are very few photographs that you can find of his work on the internet. So I guess it makes sense that he would not be free with that.
Have you seen the image of double negative where you're standing in a trench and looking across and seeing the other trench? Because that's in the book, and that's important in terms of understanding this concept, which is the trench that's not there, where there's the trench number 1, and then the void, and then the trench number 2. And you don't see that aerially, but you see it when you're standing in the trench. And that also relates to images.
I don't think I had that photograph.
That's in the book.
It's in the book? Yes.
It's a beautiful way to look at that, being down in there, and it's really hard to get to.
I mean, it's extraordinary that he created something by actually taking something out. You know, he didn't really build something. And I think I so admired that because it was just ingenious. And in a way, the economy, I mean, it required labor, but the economy of the gesture is so incredible. And that's why I think those Kuchi Tunnels are so extraordinary, too, because it's about labor, but it's about an economy, too.
Have you seen father's work, the archaeologist.
I know some of it, yeah.
He did removals, I think.
Yeah.
He's even spoken
Yeah.
about this, but he did
Yeah.
removals inspired by his father's excavations of Indian sites.
Yeah.
Can you say
Yes.
something about working with the military and the way in which political sympathies or your position vis-a-vis the military is a question that any viewer would have as they come to the work, and how you address that?
Well, yeah, no, it's something I think about a lot, and I think that's why I asked the question whether, the idea of power in Heizer's work and how far it really goes. It's difficult for me, and I think sometimes people don't quite understand that I'm actually fascinated by the military machinery, how everything works and how war is conducted. And I think that up until the Vietnam War, there was a certain sympathy with the military, following World War II and what happened there. And then suddenly, the military was sort of pegged in a very negative position, and so it's been really hard for it to come out. So anything associated with it means that you're pro-war, and there's no black and white. And I think I'm just trying to be more nuanced about my position. And I think, by just looking at how things are conducted, how things are made, and how things are done, more than actually trying to say something about my position with the war. I think having lived through a war probably, gives you a different approach to things, and in a good way and a bad way. I think I because I've lived through such traumatic moments that I sort of actually try to avoid it. So, I don't see any point in trying to recreate certain things, whether I work with the reenactors, trying to recreate, terribly distressful moments, or try to put myself in those positions. But I think that, it's a project that I think allows the viewer to see the military from a different point of view. It's certainly not objective, and I have developed sympathy, and I think, and I tell myself, well, it's because I'm interested in the gun, the gear, but I think sometimes it's more than that, and maybe it's an identification with the oppressor. I think when we left Vietnam, I wanted to live with the Americans because they had the planes to take me out of Vietnam. So in a way, they destroyed our country, but they provided, the freedom. So it's very difficult to kind of dissociate those feelings. So I think it's kind of a mess. And I think another way I try to approach the subject matter is to talk not just about war, but I think the preparation for war, or to try to talk about the aftermath of war. And I think that's what 19th century combat photography did, because, the film was so slow, they had cumbersome cameras, they couldn't photograph action. So you see pictures that Timothy O'Sullivan did after the battle. You see pictures of battlefields afterwards. So it's really about what you don't see and trying to imagine it. And I think that's just as interesting to me as covering war. And in terms of, the idea of a war photograph and a picture of Heizer's work, most people say, you cannot experience war through a photograph. You have to be there. Even though, there's some kind of a thrill when you see a picture of destruction or some really gruesome battle, there's nothing that really that could stand in for the real experience of war. Yeah?
Why would Michael Heizer give that work that name, that title, Double Negative? It seems to be speaks more to photography or to some kind of rhetorical language and
Well, negative had to do with the fact that he was removing something.
Two cuts, like two negative incisions. Let's see.
and so you think it's simply he's just being plain. He's just speaking plainly, really.
On the surface he is, but of course the ramifications are much larger than that. But the straightforward matter-of-factness is something that seems to interest him. But it's a loaded, obviously it's a loaded title. It's like works metaphorically. We stuff in the photographs. I mean, there are many ways to read it, but the initial depth and descriptive aspect to it is something he's not indifferent to.
Also, if you're in if like you said, you don't realize the depth until you're actually in it, then you don't really know the double negative, and a double negative is not a positive. I don't know, it's like a play on words.
And the void space is kind of a positive.
Yeah.
You could picture what you removed as the sculpture, that is the sculpture.
Yeah.
And it's stretching across that void, between the two box canyons.
There's the negative that he created, and then there's the negative that's not there, that's implied by connecting the two changes.
Yes, sir.
Good question. You talked about the landscape art and connected it to the bombing in Vietnam. And you kind of cast a dark light on the landscape art. But is it possible to see the reverse of that? To see what was done to the Vietnamese landscape as in like aesthetic or
In a positive way?
positive way?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, I didn't want to make some kind of, simple connection, but I think this was something that was going on, and it's done for a utilitarian reason, for tactical reasons. No, there was nothing positive. I mean, nature is incredible. Everything has grown back. I still saw some craters when I went to Vietnam in the early 1990s. They've been used as ponds and other things, but there's certain parts of Vietnam where there are too many ponds for it to just be naturally occurring. But I can't think of any positive things that have come out of that.
Not even in the representation of it, that you don't see that?
In the representation of the landscape? I don't know of any photographers who've really extensively photographed the landscape in that way, or the landscape of the war in that way. I mean, the few pictures I've made somehow refer to it, but I think when I went to Vietnam, I wanted to avoid anything that had to do with the war. And the Vietnamese photographers, unfortunately, I think are still working in the tradition of Ansel Adams and Stieglitz, the last that I know of. So I think there's no, I don't think that has helped create something.
But your work seems to take off from documentary photography of that time.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
But can you look at that photography as, is there another interest to it besides documenting? Do you know what I mean?
You mean the photographs that were made or my pictures?
The photographs that were made.
The photographs that were made.
Is there some sort of retrospective that you can...
Yeah, no, I mean, that picture of the bomb craters that I showed you, it's actually a photograph that I purchased in Vietnam during my first trip, since we left Vietnam since we were evacuated from Vietnam. So 25 years later, I met this North Vietnamese war photographer who had that entire collection in his house, and I was just in awe of it because, there's something extremely beautiful about, what happens to the landscape. And I picked those pictures, and I think I sort of stored them somewhere and kept looking back at them, and didn't really quite know what to do, but they had an effect on me. And I think, looking at those pictures, and I have other pictures of the rescue of a pilot, I have pictures of air raids, there's something about the way of the land. And actually, I'm thinking of another idea. When I was working on these photographs of these guys who reenact the Vietnam War in North Carolina, I was more interested in the land, and I wanted to, understand how radical that was from other sorts of combat photography that was done besides the 19th century. So if you look at contemporary work, it's always about the human story. So they get in really close. Sometimes you get a sense of the landscape. But if you look at 19th century combat photography, it's really about the scale and the activity versus the scale. So I did look at Vietnamese combat photography, and the idea of the landscape was much more present. And I'm not sure why, but it was definitely much more present. So I'm sorry, it's kind of long-winded, but. Yeah, sure.
You use a view camera?
I use a 5x7 view camera, yes.
And so the photos that you purchased, these war photos are probably shot on a Canon.
I think they were large format. They were medium format. They were very sharp. Yeah, they were very sharp. And a lot of the photography that I saw was on, medium format as well. I think, because of the influence of French photographers in Vietnam, back during the colonial times, the large format was still something that was very prevalent. And because the way the North was cut off from everything, a lot of things just sort of remained the way it was. And so, of course, they moved to the Russian handheld camera, but there were a lot of, French cameras, larger format, medium format, that were used for a long time. Yes?
Okay. I was just wondering, this is kind of an idea that came to me as you were speaking, but you set up this triangulation between kind of the warfare and photography and then this land art. And I see that you're setting up these connections, but I'm wondering whether you see any sort of, not photography of land art, but like some element of the photographic in the land art in its relationship to memory, because it seems like often photographs are documents of a memory or an effort to kind of preserve, and not always, but they can be. And then it seems to me like Heizer is attempting to create a memorial, in a sense, in creating these kind of permanent structures. So there seems to be like a photographic element to his work,
right,
but that it's not photographed. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's not photographable because there will never be a definitive picture, right. And so I think a photograph could be a souvenir. I don't think it could be a memory in that sense. But if you
commonality between photography and his work, in that they seek to kind of preserve something that's being lost, or no?
Well, I think what I'm interested in photography is some kind of intermittent moment, something that happens that you want to capture that is ephemeral. And it happens because the light was just right, because you're in the right place, and something happens, and it's like a confluence of things. And it's just like this snap moment. And I think that's what the kind of pictures that us fine art photographers are interested in, something that sort of brings a moment that perhaps was not there and will not be there again, or something. So in that sense, perhaps there's something with Heizer, but I think that those things that we look for may not come from just the architecture, because it's something that he created. It's not part of everyday life, and it's not random, and it's not. I think what works in photography are the simple miracles of unexpected juxtapositions and the miracles of surprises that happen. And So I don't think that happens, when you go to, besides, perhaps the perfect light or something, because it's all planned, So I think in that sense, you can't get, the same kind of photographic revelations you would with what we're looking for in fine art photography. Am I making sense?
Probably a good moment to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you.